All right. Hello and welcome to the live podcast recording of the Imagine Belonging podcast. I'm your host, Rhodes Perry, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation with Paolo Gaudiano. So, a little bit of context before we get going. I think that most of us recognize that over the past 3 years, many of our workplaces have made significant investments to establish and or advance our diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging commitments. And sadly, some of these efforts have lost some momentum, primarily due to politicians, courts, and sometimes customers challenging this work with false claims. And these claims overlook the many decades of research, which we'll talk about, and case studies underscoring the significant return on investment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging programs. And the increasing polarization of DEIB workplace commitments spawns new and unexpected challenges. Many of these challenges we're grappling with right now. And that's why we're hosting this really, really important conversation with Paolo Gaudiano. Paolo is the founder and chief scientist of Aleria, which is an impact startup that measures inclusion to help organizations have happier employees and superior financial performance without guesswork or backlash. And that's for some of the reasons why I'm really, really grateful, Paolo, that you're here today. Together, we're just going to explore a little more deeply what we DEIB professionals, inclusive leaders, along with those folks who are joining us in this space, are experiencing right now. 2023 has been a really interesting year in doing this work, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you. So welcome. It's nice to have you here with us today.
Thank you, Rhodes. It's a real pleasure being here and quite an honor. Very grateful to be invited. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to get started first with just a congratulations. You've got a forthcoming book deal coming out, and I love the title. It's called Measuring Inclusion, Higher Profits, and Happier People Without Guesswork or Backlash. And so I know I know book writing is a big endeavor, and I'm excited to get my copy when it's ready. And I'm curious, could you share with us a little bit about the inspiration for writing this book? What was the big idea that you had, and why did you feel like you're investing some of your life force and getting this idea out there into the world?
Well, thank you. That's a really good question, and it actually allows me to do something that I always like to do whenever I'm talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I've been doing now for about 8 years. I always start by kind of talking about jokingly about the white elephant in the room. What is a white male, cisgender, heterosexual, fully privileged human being like me talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And I came into it. My career actually started in academia, doing a lot of analytical type work, AI, neural networks. And then I left academia to become an entrepreneur. And I spent most of my life really trying to quantify that link between individuals and whatever social context they are in, whether it's a company or whether it's a driver on a highway or whatever, a person at a party, whatever the case might be. And throughout my life, I was very intrigued by diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I always thought that I'm either going to be an activist or there's not a whole lot I can do about it. And then one day I was sitting in on the umpteenth session on how do we get more Black people into tech, or how do we get more women into leadership roles? And I was really struck by the very sharp distinction between the individual experiences that people shared. And then when it came to solutions, it was very broad generalizations. Oh, we need to change the hearts and minds of corporate America. And as I was sitting there mulling over, thinking like, how do you connect those two? I thought, wait a second, this is what I've been doing at the time. I've been doing that for 20 years in a variety of fields. Maybe I can apply this to DEI. And in particular, what I felt was that we needed tools that could help leaders who look like me, who may be ignorant or at least unaware of a lot of issues about DEI, figure out how something like DEI can impact their organization. Not statistically speaking, a lot of organizations, but how can it impact their organization? So I got really excited about it. This was 8 years ago in 2015. I dropped everything I was doing. I spent some time doing research, built these computer simulations, and then started Aleria a few years later, and then also ARC, which is a 501c3 that does research, and as well as some academic work that we're doing on the side as well. And what came out of that was I wanted initially to build a big platform for kind of like strategic thinking. And what we realized that we were missing a very important ingredient, which is that we could build a simulation in which we have people with different characteristics, but what mattered was what happens to those people as a function of their characteristics. And I remember very distinctly a chief diversity officer of a very large organization that came to me about 5 years ago and said, I want to give you the data, the diversity data from my company, and I want you to simulate what's going on in my company. And I realized I couldn't do it. And so we went back to the drawing board and said, well, we need to understand, we need to ask people what happens to them that makes them experience different kinds of, have different kind of experiences at work. And so we came up with this unique way of what we realized later was measuring inclusion by measuring exclusion. And so we got very excited about it. We realized there were a ton of companies and organizations that were very eager to figure out, how do you define inclusion in a very tangible way, let alone measure it? We all talk about inclusion as, the definition that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. Well, that's very intuitive, but unless you're running a party company, it's not very useful. So long story short, in 2020, actually, right before late 2019, early 2020, right before COVID, we developed this way where we would do workshops and invite people to share experiences and then to categorize them in a way that gave us a combination of qualitative and quantitative data. Then COVID hit, we had to move it to online, develop a platform, and pretty soon realized we're sitting on a trove of amazing data and amazing insights that could be linked very directly to what happens in an organization and to the performance of the organization. So I spent about 3 years with my colleagues developing the platform, collecting data, doing research, working with an increasing number of clients, and eventually realized this is something that needs to get out there. There is a real desperate need to move beyond measuring just diversity as being kind of the only proxy that we use. And interestingly, I started thinking about this book about a year ago, and I talked to a couple of publishers, and I was kind of struggling with what I was seeing, and then I could tell that there was the beginning of the backlash. And so in a way, the fact that I now have, I have a book deal and it's going to come out next September, I think the timing is crucial because of the fact that the backlash actually makes it very, very important that we develop tools and methodologies that can help us to get beyond the backlash by providing very quantitative measures that individual leaders can look at and use for their organization. So long story short, I'm writing a book and looking forward to it coming out soon.
Yeah, no, I think that origin story is really important, just in how you arrived in doing the work, what motivates you, and really using your expertise to enhance this field, right? A field that's still maturing, and really getting clear beyond just kind of looking at representation, looking at people numbers and groups of people that either are present in the organizations that we work in or not. Really looking at behaviors. How do you measure inclusive behaviors, right? How do you measure systems that we're trying to change to be more fair, more equitable? How do you measure belonging, right? And I love that you contrast, inclusion with exclusion. And a lot of the work that I do is kind of looking at measures, those ingredients of belonging, but then also looking at the ingredients of exclusion, which unfortunately tend to show up more in our workplaces than the inverse. So really, really helpful background. I appreciate that. I wanted to kind of go into talking about the power of metrics, right? So you're talking about how persuasive data can be to move along, maybe not even like the most recalcitrant leaders, but like the folks in the middle that just need a compelling case and aren't as deeply connected to the work as many of us who are in the DEIB field, right? And so in the subtitle of your book, just kind of reminding folks, higher profits and happier people without the guesswork or backlash. And so so talk to us a little bit more about the power of metrics and how they can help eliminate what you are labeling as guesswork. So maybe start with us, like, what is the guesswork that you see happening sometimes in organizations, and how do you see the work that you're doing at Aleria to kind of give more of a story with the data that you all are collecting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I like to tell people about what I call the diversity disconnect, which is that even though we talk about it used to be diversity and inclusion. First it was diversity, then diversity and inclusion, then became diversity, equity, inclusion, then belonging, justice, access, etc. But the reality is that if you look at the vast majority of initiatives and the vast majority of data, it's only about diversity. We only look at the D. And the problem with the D, with the diversity, is that it's a very indirect kind of measurement. So it's not a leading indicator, to use kind of business jargon, because of two reasons. One of them is that it takes a long time for the level of diversity of a company to change. You have to hire people, terminate people, and that can take a very long time to make any significant change. But also it's indirect in the sense that whatever you do as an initiative may or may not have contributed to what happens 3 years from now. There's going to be a million different factors that are contributing that range from the economy to social justice issues out there to things that are happening in your company. So it's almost like I used to use an analogy that it's almost like being blind and being given a walking cane that is 30 feet long and made of very soft rubber. It's like it really doesn't give you a lot of visibility into what's happening. And so a lot of the guesswork comes from people trying different initiatives and then not being able to understand whether those initiatives are having an impact, and if there is an impact, whether it's actually due to initiatives or not. And then when you throw in the fact that, unfortunately, a lot of the initiatives, especially in the last 3 years since the murder of George Floyd, unfortunately, a lot of the initiatives have actually led to backlash, I think in part because they were not necessarily designed in a way that was meant to be constructive. And so with all of that, you end up seeing a lot of guesswork. You end up seeing a lot of people that are, they only have one metric. That's the only thing that they have, and it's not a very good metric. And so that leaves you kind of wondering about what's going to happen. The backlash also comes, if I may just draw on a little bit longer, I've been giving a talk recently, and I've been writing in Forbes about the fact that when you focus on diversity, you create an implicit problem, which is something like this. Let's say that you have a company of 1,000 people. And right now, let's say that 20% are women and 10% are men of color and 10% are women of color. And you say, okay, we're going to change those numbers. We're going to increase the diversity. We're going to increase the number of women from 20% to 30%, and the number of people of color from 15% to 20%, whatever the case might be. And because we believe that diversity is such a great thing, we expect that the company will grow by 20% in the next 3 years. Well, if you do the math, you realize that basically there is no way to get there unless you increase dramatically the number of women, men of color, women of color, and you decrease the number of white men. Now, if you're a white man, you're going to look at it and you're going to say, I'm sorry, that's not good. You're discriminating against me, and you're doing it specifically because of my gender and my race. And I'm sorry, but you cannot argue that that's the wrong point of view. What is wrong is that we are focusing, in my opinion, on the wrong targets. Because if you think about it, there's a very, very interesting study that comes out every year from McKinsey and Lean in which they look at gender. And right now they look at gender and race disparities across a bunch of industries. And the really telling chart is one that shows you the breakdown of men, white women, women of color, men of color at the entry level. And then what happens is you go from entry level through, succeedingly higher levels until you get to the C-suite. White men pick up 23% more representation as you go from entry level to the C-suite. And all of the other groups lose that much. That's an enormous, enormous change, which means that the problem is that we're losing phenomenally good talent along the way. It's like having a colander that's leaking desperately, and you're just trying to put more water into the top. It's not going to help you. And what we really need to figure out is, what is the true problem? And so if you go to white men and you say, we're going to reduce your numbers, but the problem is that you're still leaking those people out, you're going to make the people of color, the people of underrepresented, underprivileged groups are still going to be upset, and the white men are going to be upset. So you're actually creating a condition that is worse than it was before, because now everybody's upset at you and you still have not improved the conditions of the company. So that's why I say the backlash is because when you focus on diversity and you only look at top level diversity and you try to change that through recruitment, you're bound to get backlash. And for what it's worth, I wrote an article in Forbes in April of 2018 in which I said, this obsession with diversity is going to lead to backlash, and we're going to run the risk of having challenges to things like affirmative action. Like, I literally wrote that in 2018. So it's something that I think is a very, very important deal that we need to look at carefully and realize that the metrics that we've been using are inadequate, and that some of the suggestions that are driven by those inadequate metrics are part of the reason why we're seeing the backlash.
Okay, so I hear that, and I'm thinking about maybe some members in our audience that would then kind of ask the question then about metrics, right? And if the metric of representation is not necessarily what will get us to having the kind of workplace that's more representative of perhaps the communities that we live in, what are some of those metrics that you're suggesting that those of us in the field kind of look towards to kind of enhance and improve our efficacy and bring in people to see the value and the benefit of what this work can look like?
And just to be clear, measuring diversity is a very important thing to do. And ultimately, my personal goal is that I would love to see significantly greater diversity, better representation across all companies. Yeah. But the point to remember is that diversity is the result of everything that happens in the organization. Yeah. And I kind of joke with people. I say, suppose I walk into my house one day and I feel that it's really cold. I look at the thermostat, it reads 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I know how to fix it. I light a match. I put a match under the thermostat and now the temperature reads 90 degrees. But meanwhile, the doors, the front door is open, the windows are drafty, and the roof is leaking. Yep. When we try to fix the lack of representation by just stuffing diversity, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're fixing the symptoms instead of trying to fix the causes. What are the causes? The causes are, going back to what I said before, it's the fact that if you look at retention rates of people of color, well, Black people, Asian, whatever, Native American, any kind of underrepresented, underprivileged, underappreciated group, if you look at their retention rates, they're always lower than white men. And we need to understand why. And to me, inclusion, when we measure inclusion, what we're really doing is that we're measuring the conditions that exist in the workplace that are attached to what makes somebody satisfied to be at work. And that has to do with everything that goes on day in and day out. And to the extent that different people have different workplace experiences because of their personal characteristics, they will have different levels of satisfaction, which means different levels of productivity, which impacts the top line of the company, and different retention rates, which impacts the bottom line of the company. And what I really love doing is by quantifying those experiences. We've recently actually launched a calculator on our website where you can put in, and it's an interactive visual calculator, where you can put in the size of your company, your revenues, your margins, your current representation levels. And then if you put in either satisfaction or inclusion scores, whether you measure them with us or on your own, it can tell you exactly how much money you're losing through bottom line because of retention rates and top line because of productivity. And when you do that, all of a sudden you're going to a business leader and you're saying, look, this is costing you money. The fact that your women are not treated the same way as your men means that their retention rate is 10% lower, which means that if you have 1,000 women, you're losing 100 women a year unnecessarily. And we know that on average, when you look from low to high, it's about 1 year's worth of salary to replace somebody, an unwanted churn. So if you have 100 women and they're making $100,000 each and you do the math, that's a lot of money that you're just literally throwing out the window, not to mention your reputation. Yeah. So when you tie measurements about what is actually happening in the organization today to representation rates, representation measures, as well as retention rates and productivity rates, all of a sudden you've completely changed the game. And the diversity will come. If you stop leaking, if you stop the bucket from leaking, you're going to retain more women, you're going to retain more people of color, your representation is going to go up. And you're going to be making it easier to attract more people because they will look at the company and say, wow, look at this organization. They really treat people like me fairly, right? So it's a completely different way of thinking about it. It's looking at the cause and the effect rather than just trying to fix the symptoms.
Yeah, I love that. I love the analogy that you just did with like kind of the thermostat in your house and kind of trying to make it warmer, lighting the match, and really kind of distinguishing those symptoms versus the conditions, like the conditions of how satisfied are you in the workplace. And, just kind of thinking about those kind of band-aid approaches of like just hiring more of a certain group of people without thinking about the conditions in the workplace that would, kind of from the vantage point of the work that I do, of thinking about the psychological safety that might not be present or the trust, that needs to be in place for someone to want to stick around, to feel like they can be themselves and to offer the genius that they were hired to bring into the workplace. So really, really good stuff. So just wanted to touch a little bit about the nature of the backlash, just to kind of, I want to note there's a lot of people here who are like, when are they going to talk about the backlash part? And so just a little bit of context, right? And we talked a little bit about this in the beginning. So add to this, but kind of from the vantage point that I see, over the past 4 decades or so, workplace, as workplace DEIB interventions succeeded, there was kind of the cyclical nature of backlash that would follow. And I think that depending on when someone has entered into this field, I think we can all give examples of different points in time of what this has looked like. And most recently, right, in the response to the police murder of George Floyd, employers have made very, very public commitments to building anti-racist and anti-oppressive workplaces. And a couple of data points that I just want to bring into the conversation. There was a recent CNBC survey that found that 88% of companies made some kind of DEIB commitment in the wake of George Floyd's murder. And just in particular, looking at Black executives, 78% of Black executives, subjective measure, observed positive change because of these commitments. And yet, since May of 2020, we've seen a rise in anti-DEIB legislation. 2023 alone, this is my count. It's probably not an accurate count. Over 50 bills in nearly 18 states. These bills propose things like defunding DEIB positions at state colleges and universities, banning workplace DEIB learning and development programs in state agencies, government agencies, banning public school DEIB learning and development programs, specifically targeting education focused on critical race theory, LGBTQIA plus history, or anything viewed as promoting social justice. So that's kind of some of the context. Obviously, the introduction of these bills is a really concerning and alarming trend. And I'd really just kind of love your take, to hear a little bit more about your thoughts of why you believe this kind of backlash is really taking root in the United States in this moment. And I know you kind of alluded to this earlier in the conversation. I just want to give this a little more space and time to talk through.
Yeah, no, these are really, really challenging problems, a very, very complex situation. I think that, and by the way, I have actually professionally, I've lived through 3 bubbles. If you consider this latest DI, I think of it as a bubble. I mean, whenever you see a huge spike in, rise in interest in something, and then it kind of goes away very quickly, you can think of it as a bubble. I've lived through the neural network bubble in the late 80s and early 90s, then lived through the internet bubble in the early aughts, and now kind of living through this. And I think that in every case, I'm very optimistic because I think times like these are an opportunity for the better companies to survive. Back when the internet bubble burst, people were saying, oh, it's the death of the web and it will never happen again. And now look at what happens, right? The entire economy is dominated by that. I think we're going to do the same thing, because when we figure out how to quantify the impact of diversifying our human assets, it's going to completely revolutionize the workplace. Just like advertising is what revolutionized the internet, was the ability to quantify the impact of advertising. So why do I bring this up? Well, because right now there is a fundamental difference between the internet bubble, the neural network bubble, and the DI bubble. It is undoubtedly the case that there are people in this country, especially in this country, that have in their own personal interest the desire to dominate other people, to suppress other people. There is no question about it. And the problem is that when you have a large majority that is kind of agnostic, they're somewhere between, yeah, I like DI, but I don't really quite know what to do about it, to I'm kind of skeptical about a DI, and everybody else in the middle. The problem is that it's very easy to come up with arguments that allow the people that are very conservative, very anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, anti-Black, anti-whatever, it allows them to come up with arguments and say, see, look at what happened, and let's just squash them. So to me, this is a very dangerous situation, because we have inadvertently created an environment that is giving those kinds of voices sort of that backlash, that rebound. So I think it's critically important that as a field, we learn to understand the arguments that they're making. We need to, in my opinion, stop making the same arguments that we've been making for years and years and years, that are either simply not very good arguments in spite of what we all think, or that they just have heard it so many times. Yelling at somebody louder the same thing isn't going to convince them any better. In fact, all you're doing is you're making people run away because they feel like they're being yelled at. It's like, how can you not understand this? How can you ignore the data? How can you come up with these false claims? Well, guess what? We need to do some soul searching, and not just some soul searching, some research, because a lot of the data that we have been using to argue for the business case or the validity is not as strong as we think it is, right? So it's a really dangerous time, because I'm concerned that the forces out there that are malevolent, and there really are forces like that, I think they're a minority, but a very intolerant, vocal minority can it basically assert itself in a very dominating way. And we know this historically, that happens not just in DI. So terrible time for backlash, incredibly important that we get out of our own bubbles, we learn to recognize the limitations of what has been tried so far, and we embrace new ways, and we think about how can we work with the people in the big majority and help them to understand in ways that we've not been able to explain before. So it's a massive, this is an incredible time. We had Web 2.0 after the internet bubble. I'm looking forward to DEI 2.0. And I think that just like Web 2.0 was very much anchored on measurement, I think that DEI 2.0 is also going to need to be anchored on measurement, and very tangible, direct measurement for organizations.
Yeah, I love that. And it's a real call to action for those of us in the field, and looking to researchers like yourself around better ways of measuring impact, right? I think that's a big part of a lot of our conversation is designing interventions, right? From the beginning of thinking about how are we going to measure, like, if this is working, how do we test and change it? How do we improve it? How do we report out the progress? And then as we're improving, how do we also manage expectations of this kind of change, change management of this nature in organizations that are very large can take a decade or more to start seeing those indicators of success, right? So
Absolutely.
there's a fatigue element that shows up as well in a culture that wants instant gratification. So it's we don't have easy work, right? But it's fun to kind of grapple with how can we do it better. And I think what you add to the field is really, really important. I want to kind of give a moment of just giving you some space of what you're seeing as like specific instances of backlash in your own work, right? So I work with a number of folks who are internal in larger organizations struggling with budgets that are evaporating or losing face time with executives to talk about progress being made. So how do you see this kind of backlash showing up in your work? And we'll talk about ways to overcome it, but I'm just kind of curious of examples that you may have
Yeah,
encountered.
no, it's definitely become very visible. And I started noticing this about a little over a year ago. I would say kind of mid 2022 was so we do these the way that we measure inclusion is that we do workshops.
Yeah.
And the workshop is very informative. We use, all kinds of ideas. We show the computer simulations. And then there's just a brief part where we introduce people to our online platform where we invite them to go and share experiences. And we noticed a couple of things. The first thing that we noticed is that early on, when we were doing these exercises, white men in the audience would either not participate or they would simply go on the platform and say, I've never felt excluded. Then it came time when we started to see people that were saying things like, oh, I was supposed to get promoted, but HR told me that because I'm not Black, they had to wait 3 months because they had to interview 3 Black people before they could actually promote me. And we started to see more of that. We started to see kind of behind the scenes. And then I will never forget, like the first time that somebody literally raised their hand in the middle of a very mixed audience of people where there were not very many white men and basically said, hey, let's face it, all of this DEI stuff, it's basically reverse discrimination and it's leaving a bunch of qualified, talented men on the sidelines who are not getting jobs because they're white men. And when you get, the first time that somebody said that in front of an audience of a couple hundred people, it was mostly women and people of color. I was like, oh, okay. And, and you have to resist the urge to say, oh, I think you're an idiot, because the fact is they're not idiots. The fact is that if they're saying that, that 50% of the room is thinking the same thing, or whoever else is like them was thinking the same thing. And the fact is that, again, when we use the wrong arguments and we say things specifically like, oh, we want to increase the number of these people, then it's a reasonable conclusion that they make. So how do you manage that? And I remember really struggling. I wrote a couple of posts about it, and then it became more evident. Now it's gotten to the point where we talk to executives who say things like, yeah, basically we have a small revolt in our hands where we have people that are literally threatening to quit if we keep doing this. And we're seeing now these days, it's ironic, but we're literally getting, when we do our inclusion measurements, we get very, very strong negative feedback from a lot of white men. And not only because it turns out that another thing is that a lot of people who are not white men have complained about the fact that they're now tagged as diversity hires. And they basically feel that they don't belong. They feel that they're being ostracized. They feel very much a sense of otherness. So you're seeing both sides of the fence coming. And so the backlash is really not one-dimensional. I mean, we're seeing in fact, one of the things we started to do recently is that when we collect our data, we now tag data or experiences that are specifically about DEI backlash. And in the most recent study that we did, an organization, we had about 1,000 people participate, roughly the same numbers of white men and others complained about DEI from both sides of the fence. So it's pretty bad out there. But again, I think we keep focusing on what I think ultimately it's the right objective, but it's the wrong practical goal to set for the organizations.
Right. Right. So on that, right, like kind of hanging with that particular example that you're sharing, where it's just like people are upset for different reasons as this work is kind of being introduced in the organizations that you're engaging with, right? And thinking about like the title of your book, kind of without the guesswork or the backlash, right? When you were writing, in some of these articles about how do we address this like false argument of like this idea of reverse racism that's happening to white cisgender straight men in the workplace, right? Like what were some of the ways, like maybe it was with metrics of how to measure or to think about this work in a different way? Like what were some of the strategies that you had offered in those articles, or what you have now that you're kind of introducing to the clients that you're working with?
No, that's a really good question. I've actually, I do one of the talks that I do is I've jokingly called it kind of, DI Mythbusters, although I can't really use that term officially because it's a registered trademark. But the idea is that there are a lot of arguments that superficially sound very compelling, like the pipeline problem, and I don't want to lower the bar, and meritocracy. And one of the things that I realize is that too often when we argue things, it's very easy to do this kind of like head to head, where it's like, oh no, you're wrong. No, I'm right. I don't know how many of the people in the audience have ever read Dr. Seuss books, but one of my favorite stories was about the north going Zacks and the south going Zacks, these two characters that are walking through the desert and boom, they bump into each other and they refuse to budge. And they sit there for like 50 years and they build a whole city around them, right? I find that in most cases, when I see somebody getting hung up on an argument like this, the best thing to do is to step back and say, is there a different way to look at it? Is there a different argument? Is there a different? So for example, when you're talking about meritocracy, one of the things that, and a lot of people, when you tell them that meritocracies are a bad idea, they're like, what do you mean? It's like, well, first of all, who gets to define merit? Right? And how is that defined? And who gets to check that it's actually, and by the way, have you set up metrics to control that your definition of meritocracy is actually accurate? Show me your data from the last 10 years showing that your definition of meritocracy is actually working. And when you do that, people are like, oh, okay. It's just BS, frankly. That's what it is, right? And the same thing with these issues of reverse discrimination. Superficially, reverse discrimination is true. The reason why the Supreme Court was able to essentially strike down affirmative action is because affirmative action, as stated, is actually a racist and it's an unconstitutional thing. You simply cannot make decisions. In a way, we shot ourselves in the foot. There is a wonderful person that I met recently, Dr. Deb Riley, who worked for a number of government agencies. She's a Black woman, and she wrote these phenomenal articles about saying, look, basically, we need to stop being so hung up on diversity. And she pointed out that a lot of what we're seeing now is the result of when laws were passed back in the time of EEO, where basically said, we built our own graves. We basically built our own boxes and we put ourselves into it. And we need to kind of learn to recognize that, yes, let's step outside of that and figure out. And I'm going to ask you one thing. This is something that I always ask or often ask my audience. When I talk about that example of the 1,000 people growing by 10%, 30%, whatever, I ask people, let me ask you, what would you like to see? Suppose that you close your eyes and it's 3 years later and you're in that ideal company. You open your eyes and you have two choices. Choice number one is that you see that you've hit all those targets, but you're still treated like crap. You're still the only one, or whatever, the only one in leadership. And you're the one that's always asked to take notes or to get the food for the meetings and people ignore your ideas. Or would you prefer to see that maybe the numbers are not quite where you want them to be, but you're treated well, people respect you, you're paid fairly for your work? Which would you prefer? What we want inclusion. We don't care so much about the numbers, especially because in an organization, you're never in the entire organization, right? You're in a room with 5 other people. Are you expecting to see exactly 13% of them to be Black and exactly 50% of them to be women? It's ridiculous. It's never going to happen. You're going to have mixed teams. The key is that you want to be able to go from a team, even if you are the only person who's maybe a Black queer woman, you should be treated exactly the same as if you were a white man. That's what you want. You don't necessarily need to look through the entire company and see how many there are. So again, I think these are all arguments that we get hung up on these things and we argue and we try to respond to what they say using the same language and we just keep repeating ourselves and it doesn't go anywhere. So try to step out of that and think about a higher way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I really like it. I'm taking a look at the time right now, and I know we're about to go into our private Q&A session. Before doing that, I wanted to kind of just lean into this kind of imagine belonging, thinking about the future that we're moving into, the world that we want to live in. As you see your book kind of coming out into the world and people are absorbing your ideas, how do you see that really shifting the way we think about measuring and communicating the value of this work? Like, what do you see, like, how do you see the book kind of influencing our field or your hopes for it?
My hope is that, so one of the things, the work that I do, as I mentioned, for 30 years now, I've been doing this work linking individuals to the collective. And I think that a lot of times it's very difficult for us to remind ourselves that when we look at statistics, they're made up of individual people. And using statistical data a lot of times has the problem that it hides a lot of the details. That's what statistics was invented to do, was to hide a lot of the details. So my hope is that one of the things that I talk about in the book is this idea that we need to recognize not only cause and effect, but the level at which things are happening. So we have our definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion is that inclusion is about what you do, diversity is what you get, and equity is what you want. And I would argue that belonging is also what you get. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But so to me, it's about inclusion is about all the things that happen in the workplace to individual people. Those have two impacts, actually three impacts. One, it will impact the diversity of the company. Why? Because ultimately you are going to have retention issues, right? So diversity is what you get. Equity is what you want. Why? Because as I said earlier, if you have very high churn rates for certain employees, it's costing you money that you should not be wasting. So ideally, you want equity, meaning that you want everybody to have the same level of experiences so that you're not inadvertently creating some problems for some employees that will be less productive and less likely to stick around. Belonging to me is also an outcome, but it's an outcome at the individual level. In other words, when people ask me, or when people ask in surveys, how do you feel that you belong in the organization? Do you feel included in the organization? To me, that's missing the point. It's like going to the doctor and the doctor asking you, how healthy do you feel today on a scale of 1 to 10? And do you think that this is a good hospital? I mean, imagine if healthcare was run like that, right? The judgment of a hospital was based on what their patients think about it, but they're not actually being cured. So to me, belonging and inclusion, the feeling of inclusion at the individual level are an outcome of all of the things that happen to you day in and day out. So in the book, one of the things that I hope that people will learn is to distinguish between what is a cause, what is an effect, what is something at the individual level, what is something at the system or kind of structural or company-wide level. If I can get those points across and help people to understand, I think that just makes it a lot easier to understand some of these arguments and to, instead of thinking them as isolated arguments, think about them in a more system level context and go, oh, I get it. Yeah, we're talking about something that impacts people at the individual level versus the organization as a whole.
Yeah. This is really, really insightful, Paolo. And I want to thank you for being a part of our live podcast recording right now. Just for folks that are watching, not necessarily in our Zoom room right now, if you want to be a part of some of our private question and answers sessions with thought leaders like Paolo, check out the Belonging membership community. That's where we're going to go right now. And if you're joining us and this is the moment that we're saying goodbye, thank you for tuning into this live podcast conversation. Super insightful. Paolo, what you're adding to the field is just going to help us become better, and thinking more critically about how we can measure our impact. And just what you've offered up today has really filled my cup. So thank you for that. And for everyone who's tuning in, bye. We'll see you in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you. Very grateful for everything and great.